I would like to introduce Kevin Anchukaitis, who is a associate professor at the University of Arizona in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Also, he's in the School of Geography and Development, and he has an appointment in a third part of the school in the Department of Geosciences. So he's been working in the laboratory of tree ring research, which is another sort of independent observed source of understanding past and present climate. So he has many different titles, but I think the way to kind of think of him is he's a Earth systems geographer specialized in the construction of the analysis of climate variability and the change during something called the common era, so that he can examine the interaction between past climates and human society. Kevin, could you come up and give your talk?
Well, while we're getting transitioned over to mine, I just wanted to thank Warren for organizing this and having me. And this is really amazing to be here with really climate science heroes, Ellen and Lonnie and Claire and Warren. So it's a real honor to be here speaking to you today. Cool. And what I'm going to be speaking about is tree rings. As Warren said, I am in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. It is the oldest laboratory of its kind. It was established in 1937. But it's not like suddenly in 1937 everyone figured out that you could use tree rings, that they were annual, and even that the width of those rings told you something about the environment. So Leonardo da Vinci in some of his writings noted that when you had a branch that was cut off, that the rings were variable. He knew that they were annual, really going back at least as far as Theophrastus. People had known they're annual. And he also picked up on the fact that there were wide rings during wet years in northern Italy and narrow rings in dry years. So this idea, or this at least conception, is not new. But the science really took on its sort of modern state and became codified and took on a set of practices through the work of Andrew Ellicott Douglas. He was actually an astronomer. He was at Harvard working for Percival Lowell. He went down to South America to establish a telescope there, and based on that experience, Lowell sent him out to the Arizona territories to look for a place to establish a telescope. And in telegrams back and forth, Lowell and Douglas decide to go to Flagstaff. There's a site outside Flagstaff called Mars Hill, and Douglas goes about constructing his observatory, or Lowell's observatory. They had a falling out. Lowell and Douglas didn't exactly agree on the presence of canals on Mars, and this resulted in Douglas being let go, asked to leave. Now, Douglas wasn't interested in the canals on Mars, didn't believe they were there. What he was interested in was sunspots and the record of solar variability, and what he had also done during this building of the observatory was, in looking at all this lumber that they used, had noticed this repeating pattern of wide and narrow rings in the trees growing around Flagstaff. And so the records of sunspots were very short, and Douglas came up with this idea that, well, maybe sunspots affect the weather, and therefore weather affects the tree growth, and I can actually get a record of sunspots going back in time by looking at the width of annual rings. And so he came up with a whole method to exactly date rings to their year of formation, and to ensure that statistically as well as visually. And he came up with these ideas of doing climate reconstructions from them. He was particularly taken with the sequoia. He knew that the sequoia were old, several thousand, 3,000 years or more. And in fact, in 1922, here in Philadelphia at the APS meeting, Douglas gave a talk 95 years ago about sequoia tree rings. So this is pretty cool. Douglas had the good fortune of, when he moved down to Tucson from Flagstaff, coming into contact with a lot of southwestern archaeologists, and they wanted to know how old these cliff dwellings were. So this is before radiocarbon, right? We're talking the early 20th century. They're making comparisons amongst pottery types and making very large sort of assumptions about the progress of societies and what stage they all move through, sometimes based on European or Old World data. But some of these archaeologists realized that the wood that is embedded in these cliff dwellings could be dated potentially by Douglas's method. The problem was, of course, Douglas was using living trees, and these were dead. But through the course of the 1920s, Douglas and his archaeological collaborators figured out how to meld the living trees with the construction timbers based on matching their patterns of wide and narrow rings, and they were able to come up with dates in the 12th and 13th and 14th century for these cliff-dwelling reconstructions. So dendrochronology has, from its very beginning, had these multiple facets. It's had archaeology, it's had ecology, it's even had astronomy and climatology. And so we've gone forth from A.E. Douglas's original lab at the University of Arizona, many of us still there, and we've gone now around the world over the last century building these tree ring, what we call chronologies, these collections of tree ring data, dated to the exact year of formation of each ring, assembled into time series that we then use to try and understand something about the past. So we can go all the way up to tree line in Alaska, in this case, or into Siberia, or to very far north, Fennoscandia, and we can find trees like these white and black spruce whose rings correspond to temperature. And so a warm year gives you a wide ring, a narrow year is a cold year. And so you can use this information to reconstruct temperature at these high latitudes and at high elevations as well. And then where I really specialize is in reconstructing drought. So as Douglas noted back in the earliest 20th century, wide and narrow rings in trees growing in arid sites or semi-arid sites correspond wide years to wet years, narrow years to dry years. So how do we actually do this? We don't cut down trees. We love trees. So we give them little hugs. We have these tools called increment bores. They're hollow. They're very sharp on the tip. They have two cutting tips, one on the end and then one that looks like a screw. Because they're hollow inside, as you wind this manually into the tree, it winds into the tree, and a piece of wood about the size of a chopstick or a pencil is now inside this hollow bore. So you can pull it out, and you have this small core. Tree barely feels it. The tree's living tissues are just around the outside, so this is like a paper cut for a tree, so to speak. Even before you get it back to the lab, you can look at it, or you can look at it on top of my very dirty fingers, and you can even start to see these patterns of wide and narrow rings. So here's 2 rings, 2 narrow, 2 wide rings. This is from a core in Vietnam. And you can already start to see that there is this variability, and it's this variability that gives us 2 things. It gives us the ability to match across trees these patterns of wide and narrow rings to ensure you're getting the dating exactly right. And then that variability contains the climate or environmental information that we're looking for. Now, you do this a lot. There's a lot of things that affect trees. So nutrients, their position in the stand. And what we really want when we're dendroclimatologists like me, paleoclimatologists, is to get a picture of the thing that influences all the trees, climate. And so we go out and collect 20, 30, 40 trees. We bring them back to the lab. We mount them in these core mounts. We date them to their exact year of formation. We verify that dating over and over again. And then we measure them at very high precision and combine them into a single time series that represents the large-scale growth of those trees going back hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. This is what you're actually seeing under the microscope. So these patterns of wide, thin-walled cells that give way at the end of the year to small, thick-walled cells. The tree goes into dormancy, and then in the next year, it starts again to grow with these thin, big cells. And this gives you the appearance of these rings, which under the microscope you can resolve as these cells. Now, there's a pathway, right, between what we want to know and what we have, these measurements of ring width or density or chemistry, and what we want to find out, temperature and precipitation. There's a process by which the tree takes in that information. It takes in water, carbon dioxide, it grows a ring, and then we get these observations. And so much of what I'll be showing you is going backwards from observation back to the environmental variable we want. Sometimes that's rainfall, and so you can take your ring width chronologies, you can build a model that relates the width of the rings to a certain amount of rainfall where you've got overlap with the instrumental record, and then you can use that model to go back in time before you've got instrumental records. Or maybe you want temperature, and you can use those annual ring widths to reconstruct temperature, also going back in time. And this long-term perspective tells you something about what the climate system was doing when you weren't watching, when we weren't watching, before we were even on this, even in places like Tibet, as Lonnie talked about, and provides this perspective on what's going on right now. So I want to show you a few cases where tree rings have been used to understand the climate of the past as a way of putting the present and the future into context. And the first one I want to show you is a reconstruction from tree rings of the flow of the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry. Colorado, for those of you who might not be familiar, is incredibly important for water resources in the West. Most of the actual precipitation happens in the upper basins, so Colorado and Utah, and then in the lower basin, California and Arizona in particular, depend on this water as part of their water budget, as part of their water resources. Both of these states drawing their complete allocation of water, and you can see the infrastructure, the Central Arizona Project, the Southern California canals that bring the Colorado River to those states and supplement and in fact make possible the growth and activities in these states. Back in 1922, the first Colorado Compact is signed. The Law of the River is now this huge body of law and cases and treaties and agreements. And back in 1922, they looked at what little information they had about the flow of the river, and they said, okay, we get about 18 million acre feet per year flowing down the river. Let's divvy up 15 of it, 7.5 to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower basin. That leaves us a little buffer, and we'll be good. Everyone's happy, everyone gets the water they need. So dendrochronologists have gone back to see whether that 18 million acre feet really represents the long-term flow of the river. And so using sets of tree ring chronologies from the upper basin that see that precipitation, that see that soil moisture, that snowpack, they can reconstruct the flow of the river. So this is what you would have known back when you signed the Colorado Compact in 1922, not even 2 decades of data, but about 18 million acre feet, and a lot of variability, but it's okay. Every year, if it's a dry year, the next year is usually wet and vice versa. So we've got about 18 million acre feet, and it bounces around, but we're okay. So we can divvy out this 15 million acre feet. So using tree rings, Dave Miko, Connie Woodhouse, and other people at the Tree Ring Lab have gone back actually to the 9th century. And what's really interesting, if you look at the blue, which is those observations of flow that they had at the time, and the black, which is the Reconstruction, is that you realize that that earliest 20th century was abnormally wet. The Colorado Compact was written up and signed at 15 million acre feet of water was given out on the basis of having 18 million, but in fact the long-term flow of the river is actually closer to 15. Now, this is a problem because that up and down variability, that year-to-year variability is still there, and so you can see some years are incredibly low in these reconstructions, less than 10 million acre feet. How do California and Arizona both get their allocation if there's not enough water in the river? And this leaves aside the very important question of the fact that Mexico, which actually has the delta of the river, would probably like that river still. And in fact, most years, the Colorado River doesn't reach the Sea of Cortez. So this long-term perspective offered by tree rings really puts this modern allocation in a better perspective. And we're trying to do similar things now with other rivers that are contentious and are being divided up, like the Mekong River. There's also something additionally worrying here, which is this period right here in the 12th century. So the idea of the compact was that, well, we get a wet year and a dry year, but it all evens out in the end. A wet year is followed by a dry year and vice versa. But we can look back in history and see periods like this where that doesn't seem to hold, where river flow was low year after year after year, decade after decade. And using a different reconstruction now of annual drought index, with negative numbers being lack of water and -2 being a rather severe lack, you can see that this period, 1130 to 1154, this 25-year period, was epically dry. So it didn't bounce back and forth between a wet year and a dry year. Imagine what would happen if a 25-year drought struck the upper basin in today's world with so many millions of people in the West, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Southern California, depending on this water. So we have this long-term perspective of past natural climate variability. And if this were to happen today, we would need to take that into account. Here's the Colorado River Compact. Here's the flow since then, both tree ring reconstructed and observed. The river has returned to its long-term mean, and in fact is even lower in some cases. And we've now been in a rather long and sustained drought in the basin. Thinking about what's going to happen in the future, you can put this into models. And so you can say, well, if the 20th century mean is accurate and there's no climate change, then there's no problem. Deliveries of water from the river will exceed requests or demands of that river water. But even if you just assume no climate change affecting the river flow in the future, you see that we're very close, knowing that long-term mean, that true mean from the paleoclimate data, to being at the point where demand for water in the Colorado River outstrips the ability of that river to supply it. Add into that declines in river flow due to declines in snowpack, increasing temperatures. And what you see is that we are on the cusp of being in a situation where the river can no longer deliver on that body of law, those agreements, those allocations. How do we deal with that? We can prepare for it, but ultimately that's an economic and political question that needs to be answered rather quickly. I want to show you some work we've done on the recent California drought that has just come to a rather dramatic end, as California droughts tend to do. My postdoc and I were sitting on the East Coast and watching this drought go on for years and years, and we were wondering, well, how unusual is this drought? And our idea was that this wasn't unusual. We look back, for instance, in the Colorado River, and we see big droughts in the past, mega droughts we call them. And so our feeling was that this current California drought wasn't particularly exceptional, but we decided to go out and test that. So we went out to California and we collected a bunch of data from these blue oak trees. They're really amazing. They can be 400 or 500 years old. But what's even cooler is that even when they die, they often stay on the landscape for hundreds of years. And so you can go out with a chainsaw. It's dead, don't worry. And Dan is taking a wedge out of this. They're very hard to core when they're dead. They submit to the chainsaw pretty well. And get this data. And so now you have 500 years of living trees and another 400 or 500 years of dead trees, and you can start to extend this record back. And so we used this amazing species to reconstruct precipitation in southern and central California. So I'll never get another reconstruction as good as this again. This species is beautiful. The blue is the observed. The black with the gray uncertainty is the reconstructed. It's almost like these things are rain gauges sitting out there. And when you look, you see, oh, well, yeah, in terms of precipitation, actually, you know, it's dry. There's no one doubting it was dry, but it's been drier in the past, for sure. And so we're like, okay, well, the rainfall is not exceptionally dry. It's not abnormal. This is not outside the range of natural variability. We then looked at another metric, though, and this is called the PDSI. It's the same drought index I showed in that earlier map. And it incorporates not only the income to soil moisture precipitation, but also what's taken out in terms of evaporation. So it reflects both the water that falls from the sky, but also the atmosphere's demand for that water back in terms of evaporation. And when we looked at this metric, it was a very different picture. In fact, 2014 edged out other known dry years, or at least overlapped with them in terms of the uncertainty. And so this was a very different result. 2014 was the driest year. It was way out in this tail. It was an exceptional drought from this metric. So not from precipitation is this exceptional, but it is in this Palmer Drought Severity Index that accounts for evaporation. So what was going on? What we realized is that it was temperature. It was the record high temperatures that California was seeing during this drought. And so if you put 2014 in this scatter plot between the drought on the y-axis and the precipitation on the x-axis, what you see is that 2014 just edges out known drought years like 1580 or 1829. But what's weird is that it doesn't have a very strong precipitation anomaly. And so we calculated in our paper that about 27% of that drought severity was due to the record high temperatures. Park Williams and his colleagues came about a year later and did a recalculation of this and got a slightly smaller number. But you're looking at somewhere around a quarter of the drought severity during the most recent California drought due to high temperatures. And those high temperatures are largely the result of increasing CO2 and anthropogenic climate change. So what we're seeing here is what we're calling hot droughts. It's not simply that precipitation is low, but on top of that, you have the atmosphere demanding more moisture back, higher evaporation, higher evaporative demand, and this is driving reservoirs lower, soil moisture for agriculture lower, and this is going to be an increasing feature of droughts in the future as temperatures continue to rise. We're now in this era of hot droughts. The last thing I want to show you in my last few minutes is a reconstruction of temperature, because we can also do temperature reconstructions from tree rings. So this is work my colleagues and I have done, and the context for this was alluded to by Claire's really nice talk, which is that temperatures are rising, and in fact, 2015 was the record high temperature for the globe until 2016 was the record high temperature for the globe this year. So 2016 was the warmest year on record. But when we say on record, records aren't very long. So satellites go back to the 70s or 60s. Even our instrumental records at best stretch back into the 1800s, late 1800s with relatively few exceptions. So what does on record mean? Is this exceptional in this longer term that the tree rings and the other paleoclimate proxies give us? And I think Lonnie has already hinted at this from the ice core perspective. So we took a network of tree ring chronologies all over the northern hemisphere. In blue, you're seeing ones that have a mix of data types of wood density and tree ring width. Green is just tree ring width. And we actually did a reconstruction where we mapped temperature anomalies by year in space. And so I have a map for every year that I can show you where it was abnormally warm, where it was abnormally cold. But you can also average this together and come up with an average northern hemisphere temperature. And when you do so, this is what you see, that there is a relatively warm period here in the medieval, sensu lato, so a pretty wide medieval period, cooling after the mid-1400s, associated probably with volcanic eruptions, which cool the atmosphere, as well as decreased solar insolation. This little ice age period here, punctuated by several strong volcanic eruptions. And then coming out of Little Ice Age, a slight increase in solar insolation, but by the time you come into the 20th century, greenhouse gas forcing takes over. And so what you see is rapid warming up through 2015 and 2016. And so in this context, what you see is that we are now at a period that's warmer than any in at least the last 1,200 years, and maybe even longer. And this rise is due to the increase in greenhouse gases and anthropogenic climate change. So often when I talk about this, I make the point that what these data reveal is that we're not talking about climate change as something that's happening in the future. Climate change and its impacts are happening now. We're already into an era of hot droughts. We're seeing this not only in California, but we've seen it now in work we've done in Mongolia. That current temperatures, which are part of that increasing trend towards hot droughts, are likely exceeding those of the last 1,200 years. But that you can use this type of knowledge, you can use knowledge from the past to help better plan the future, to understand the range of climate variability and how far outside of that we might be. And again, what we're seeing in these records is the fingerprint of climate change that's happening now. It's not just something in a model simulation. We're living it right now. So thank you very much.
Questions?
In the back.
Yeah, Rich Schiffer in Indiana. There's been a lot of talk about extremes of weather these days. And you hinted at this, but I'm wondering what the record of not the changes in means, but the changes of variability in the historical record tells us about what we could expect in terms of extremes.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Extremes are really important because they have these often very large impacts in terms of infrastructure or economics. Sometimes we have trouble resolving those events if they're sort of like daily, like a big 2-day or 3-day rainfall event, because we don't have that resolution. We have maybe seasonal to annual resolution. So sometimes we don't see some of those very short-term extremes in these annual or seasonal records. But what we do see in a lot of cases is a move towards, at least in terms of droughts, is greater variability. So not simply is there this long-term sort of trend towards overall drier conditions, but around that trend, you're getting a higher variance. Now, it's tough to, we have tried to detect this in the paleoclimate record. We do see periods of high or low variance that appear to occur naturally, but what the climate models tell us is that this increase in variance is almost certainly going to accompany this change in mean, and we may be seeing the edge of it here. I think we're right on the cusp of it. The work we've done in California and the work we've done in Mongolia, the last sort of 10 years really start to stand out. Is that enough time to make any conclusions? Probably not yet, but it's at least consistent with what we expect from these climate models and this move towards a more variable climate, wet to dry. And that will certainly be the case in California, which is already that way, which bounces between drought and flood. That's only to become more extreme. Drier dry periods, wetter flood periods. Thanks.
Two questions on Bob Jervis from New York City. The one is technical and probably simple. The other one really is for everyone, the scientists in the group. The first question is, how do you get temperature from the rings? Second question is, when is enough certainty from all the evidence, and maybe a way to say, okay, we really know this, that is CO2 is one of the main drivers and produced by human. And one thing, my way to get at it would ask, thinking of all the scientific knowledge over the last 200 or 300 years, when have we had cases when all the scientists were really, really sure of something, right? And then 3 years later they said, whoops, forget that.
Yeah. So first, your technical question. The way we have done this as a field is, if you want a temperature-sensitive tree, go to a place where temperature is the most limiting factor for vegetation growth. So you can go to the tree line, you can go to high elevations, and that kind of guarantees that instead of having a mixed signal of some precip, some temperature, you're getting a more pure temperature signal. We also have been using wood density instead of ring width, which is a stronger or better tracks the temperature variability, and it's probably because it's a relatively simple physiological process, that the longer the summer lasts, because it's warmer, the denser the wood gets. So that seems to be the way to go, and you can actually do that in places that are maybe not ideal for these temperature reconstructions. But it is more limiting for doing temperature reconstructions as compared to precip reconstructions, which we can do very broadly. Yeah, the second question. Sherwood Rowland, Nobel Prize for work on the ozone, had a quote that goes something like this. What's the point of having come up with a science that's good enough to make predictions if all we're going to do is let those predictions come true? And so I think we have a science that's good enough for predictions. I think what you're seeing is some very robust results that emerge. So increasing drought in drylands, higher temperatures, sea level rising, decreases in sea ice. And so all these things are robust predictions that come from the part of the science that's fairly well understood. So are there uncertainties? Absolutely. I think extremes is one area we're still working on a lot as a community. But we know enough, I think, to make predictions, and we would like some of those predictions not to come true. We would like not to lose tropical ice caps. We would like the oceans not to rise a meter over the next 85 years. And so I think that's where we stand. I think there's things we can do that we won't regret, and that it would seem like a good idea to do those. But that is a larger conversation we have to have. We can talk about the predictions as scientists. We can talk about our uncertainties. Ultimately, we have to decide what political and economic path we follow as a community, not just a community of scientists. Yeah. Thank you.
Next question.
Mark Feldman from Stanford. That period in the 12th century appears to be the same period that was associated with the demise of the Anasazi.
Yes.
And it's commonly called the 100-year drought. Are there other examples where we know that a whole civilization has disappeared in the face of such a drought?
Yeah. So this is actually a really interesting time period. This is in the sort of broadly medieval era, where we see a lot of these kind of mega droughts. And what's interesting, to go back to Douglas, is that the hardest time Douglas had in bridging the living trees to the cliff dwellings was the very latest 1200s. And even back in the 1920s, Douglas realized that there was a good chance the reason they were missing those rings still, that they hadn't bridged that gap, was because something had happened in the climate system. It turns out he was right. There's a period of 30 years that's called the Great Drought, that corresponds with the ancestral Pueblo basically abandoning these dwellings, these cities in the Four Corners region. So, and we see a lot of these megadroughts. We see one that's associated with the last phase of Cahokia as well. We've looked at this in terms also of the demise of Angkor in Cambodia. And what you actually see is that as Angkor's water infrastructure goes into disrepair, they become more susceptible or vulnerable to these droughts and floods too. And that there are two big droughts right before the collapse of Angkor in 1431. Other known cases are the Maya. We don't have quite the resolution to talk about the Maya collapse because the tree rings are trickier in the tropics, as you probably saw from the map. But we do think that there is this association between climate and society. I'd say on the other side that we've done work in Mongolia that shows that the rise of Genghis Khan and the sort of establishment of his empire corresponds to an exceptionally wet period on the steppes. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to mount literally mounted a conquest of the world, and your soldiers have to have 5 horses each, and you need to have this very large army, it makes sense. Grass is the fuel upon which you would drive an army like that. So I do think there's these connections. I think where we are now is trying to look at times when climate is severe and civilizations don't collapse, or civilizations collapse without a clear climate driver, and try and understand what that tells us about human societal vulnerability to climate or resilience to climate. And I think that's a more complicated question, and we're trying to work more with historians and archaeologists to bring all those data together on that. Thank you.
The optimum, Jane Shan Miller from UCLA, optimum growth of tree varies from tree to tree. Some condition might be optimum for one, some will be not. Do you compensate when you compare a global study on the ring structure unless you're using the same tree, or you use different trees?
Different trees, yeah. So that's a great question, is how do we deal with different species response to different elements of the climate system? There's a few things that tend to be conserved over large areas. One is that soil moisture during the growing season is something that trees care a lot about. And you actually see some interesting differences. So in the West, where I live, the big important source of water for trees in the summer is the water that fell often as snow during the winter. You move to the east or you move north out of the southwest, and it's summer rainfall that's important for summer soil moisture and summer growth. But we can kind of get around that by using soil moisture, which is this integrative factor. Again, for temperature, what we're seeing is a range of responses, but it's almost all summer temperature, which makes sense, right? It's during the growing season. So for temperature reconstructions, we can use just summer temperature for that. But we do have to take this into account when we do these very large-scale reconstructions is, do we have different seasonal responses? And the nice thing about tree rings is we actually have a good handle on what those seasonal responses are, and we can try and control for that.
Okay, we have a question from up in the audience and upstairs here.
Conrad Harper, New York City. My question somewhat follows the one just asked, and that is, are some trees better than others for this purpose?
All trees are awesome. Yeah, we've found certain species whose growth is very tightly tied to certain aspects of the climate system. So those blue oaks I showed you are just phenomenal. I mean, they track every up and down in precipitation that they see. It's really stellar. Scots pine in northern Fennoscandia does similar things with temperature. Like if you put the temperature and the tree rings right over each other and you didn't tell me which one it was, I'd have a hard time telling you. Bald cypress in the southeast U.S., for some reason, really responds very clearly to spring rainfall, even though it's got its feet in these cypress swamps. Sometimes, though, you have trees that have a very mixed response. So white pine around here, for instance, has a bit of a temperature response and a bit of a precip response, and this makes this more complicated. So over this sort of century of science, we've learned that there are certain species that have very clear climate responses, and there's other ones that have more of a mixed climate response. And then the tropics presents a whole nother challenge. We have to find trees that put on annual rings. We have to make sure that those rings are reflecting climate, and then we have to find enough of them to actually build a chronology. So if I go out into the mountains in Arizona, I can easily core 20 ponderosa pine in 20 minutes, probably. If I go into a tropical rainforest with 200 species in a hectare, some of which probably aren't even identified, it becomes more challenging. So the tropics have provided, are this sort of frontier that we're starting to sort of move into. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to